So over a year ago now, we put out a video called The Truth About Sound Quality in Headphones. Some of you may have seen it. Since then, we've continued to uncover more and more evidence of exactly what we talked about in that video. Many of you guys have learned along with us as we've continued to identify ways in which the sound is not the sound, like understanding how different head-worn devices can react in unique ways across a wide range of different heads, how this affects the sound in situ when people are actually wearing these headphones, having gone to the lab in the UK to get our HRTFs and to understand the differences among each of us when we're listening to these devices. And it's revealed a number of things about sound quality, but more importantly, about how the discourse online about these products should be. Now, recently, Cameron and Griffin on our team were invited to give a presentation on this topic at CanJam London. And rather than picking bits and pieces to make a concise video for you guys to watch, we're going to give you the whole unedited bit in its entirety. So, without further ado, enjoy.
So, the title of today is, why can't we just agree what a headphone sounds like? I'm sure you are all familiar with having discussions either in person or particularly online, where you've tried something or you've seen someone try something, and either you've seen them give some feedback or an opinion which just does not align in the slightest with what you heard, and you can't help but come to the conclusion that one of you must be wrong. And today we're going to talk about whether that is the case, because I think it's a little all too familiar to go, this headphone's bright and peaky.
No, it's fine.
Well, I think you're deaf.
I think you're deaf and poor.
I just can't afford the nice thing that you've got,
Yeah.
which is every forum thread in history, pretty much.
So at the crux of this is the fact that people just tend to disagree about headphones. And sometimes it's a hateful back and forth conversation between people on mostly digital forums where you can't actually look at the person. Yeah. But a lot of the time, between people, it is a fairly normal, even pleasant conversation about a shared interest. The latter usually hinges on a bit of understanding about how these devices actually behave and vary across people. And the more we look into the behavior of headphones as acoustic playback devices that couple to human heads, it just kind of becomes evident that we need to accept some margin of difference, error, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to how it's going to behave on people's heads that aren't your own.
Because the thing is that usually people will talk about what they prefer. What is it that you prefer versus me, and how this is different. People might prefer a brighter headphone. They might prefer more bass. And we've got quite a lot of existing research to talk about that. Yeah. Most of you will probably have heard of the Harman research and the Harman target itself, which is kind of trying to design a single line which pleases the majority of listeners. But what a lot of more modern research is showing is that it's not just a difference in what people actually prefer, it's a genuine difference in what you are experiencing. Yes. So on the left, we've got some info from the Harman research. The top one there shows the general range of, on the left, you've got the range in bass, and on the right, you've got the range in treble of what people ended up liking. And on the bottom there, you can actually see a range of different final responses, which were, for the most part, and correct me if I'm wrong there, Griffin, these were all equally preferred, pretty much.
Yes, so the class that was segmented out, the largest class in the 2018 research, found all of those responses roughly preferable, and roughly equally preferable, excuse me. And you'll notice that, they do follow a similar trend, some of them, but there's quite a lot of difference in that field of variation. And if we talk about the second part there, which is the HRTF, which is the other thing that comes up in a discussion of why people may disagree a lot of the time. Those are a smattering 1,000 human HRTFs measured at the blocked ear canal entrance.
We should probably just mention, for those that don't know, HRTF stands for head-related transfer function. And the best way to explain that is the way in which your head and ears modify sound by the time it gets to your eardrum. So if there is some theoretical, completely neutral sound source or speaker playing at you, if you measure it with a measurement microphone, it'll be completely flat. But your ear is a very complex filter. It's doing all sorts of weird stuff. And by the time it gets to your eardrum, it's anything but flat. And because everyone's head and ears are different, as you can see there, people's ears are doing quite different things indeed.
Yeah, by the time you get to like 3 kilohertz, you're looking at plus or minus 5 decibels of deviation, which is already significant. But by the time you've reached the upper treble, you're looking at like easily 20 decibels of difference. And that is the difference between absolutely hating a headphone and potentially absolutely loving a headphone.
Yeah, and so when people are talking, politely, I think you've been a little optimistic there, if I'm honest, talking about why they might have a disagreement on a headphone. It's either, in some cases, people who are a little bit more familiar with the concept of an HRTF saying, oh, well, our ears must just be different, or we just straight up prefer different things. But what we wanted to talk about today is that there is something outside this, because with an HRTF, the way in which your head and ears are modifying things, as we'll talk about shortly, generally, if you account for that when you're considering how a headphone is behaving on your head, if your ear is, for example, amplifying 4 kilohertz more than mine, it's going to be doing that for everything you hear in the real world, every speaker you listen to, and most headphones you listen to.
You would
and
assume.
so the difference between our ears shouldn't really matter because it's always going to be the same, and so you're always going to get that difference. But there is a difference which causes a lot of problems, which is HPTF.
Yeah, so HPTF, this basically is just a fancy way to say it's the frequency response of a headphone on an ear. But it is something that is worth discussing because there's indication that the behavior of the headphone itself is not necessarily linearly perfectly correlated to the typical anatomical impact that your ear would have from a speaker in a reference field like a diffuse field HRTF.
It's easier to understand once you show it visually. So, for example, here we've got two measurements. This is the same headphone, the Sennheiser HD800S. I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with that. And the blue line shows it measured on the Grass 43AG. The red line shows it measured on the B&K 5128. And understandably, these are different because the two measurement rigs have different ears. And so the ears of the measurement rig are going to be impacting the sound in different ways, even though the headphone itself is exactly the same.
Yes, and because this is an open back headphone, we can see most of the response up until maybe 3-4 kilohertz is very similar. And then above that range, where in one of the prior slides, you saw the HRTF differences start to go wild above this frequency, you start to see the two ears vary in a way that is, I would say, predictable.
Yeah, and so if we look here, we can see that the biggest difference is generally that the 5128 is getting a little bit more treble, particularly around that 5-6 kilohertz area. It's generally a bit brighter. And in fact, if we look at the HRTF of these two rigs, so the way in which the head and ears of these rigs modify sound normally, we see a pretty similar difference. It's a little bit brighter in that region, which would potentially explain that difference.
Yeah, and partially it does, right? Like, when you look at this, it is obvious, I think, what the general trend of the two measurement rigs would be when you're evaluating responses next to each other. But that's not the sum total of the differences.
So the theory is that, okay, well, if we can work out exactly what each ear is doing, if we just take the head and ear out of the equation, then surely we'll end up with the same result, right?
You would hope.
No.
But no.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, just subtracting away the relevant HRTF, the diffuse field HRTF for both headphones or all headphones is not sufficient to really remove the idiosyncrasies of what is the HPTF or the headphone behavior on that ear. And these differences that remain are significant and, as we'll kind of talk about in a bit, perceptually relevant. These are not differences that are measurement error. If these two rigs had mouths and could speak, the Gross rig would probably have a little bit more of a complaint about the treble response, whereas the B&K would maybe feel it's a little bit smoother, easier to listen to.
Yeah, but you can see that despite the fairly big difference we had here, once we do compensate away the differences between the ears, we do end up with something which is broadly a lot more similar.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why, when you're looking at measurements, it is better to look at HRTF compensated measurements, because then you are looking at what is the headphone actually doing on that head, not what is the head and ear, because your ear is not going to be the same as the one on the measurement rig. You don't want to be looking at what someone else's ear is contributing to the sound. And the reason generally as to why these are now much more similar is because even though the ear on the 5128 and the ear on the Grass rig are different, both of them are based on a large subset of data and are generally meant to be effectively an average of the human ear.
Yes.
So they're both going to be fairly similar because once you get enough people, you're going to converge on a more similar kind of shape.
So with these rigs, for one, they are built on quite similar population averages. So the space around measurement fixtures broadly is overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly European specifically. So the anatomical averages that inform the construction of these very handsome rigs here, they are very similar, and they are made to comply with the same standards. Whereas if you are to just pull two people off the street and compare their ear responses, their experiences when wearing a headphone, you're probably going to see a lot more disagreement, both in what they report verbally, but also in the acoustic responses they will actually receive at their ears, than you would with the two things that are built to a similar standard.
Yeah, and we've run into this problem when we're reviewing and producing stuff on various different headphones, where even though we've got a 5128 and we can measure a headphone and show what it's doing, and then we'll go, well, this is how it measures, but I don't hear it like that. I'm actually hearing a peak that doesn't show on the measurement, or I'm not hearing this issue that shows on the measurement, or I'm just straight up hearing it differently. So what is the solution to that? Well, we turn ourselves into measurement microphones. This is something which we worked with the Imperial College of London, the Dyson School of Engineering, to do recently, where we actually captured our own HRTFs. So we used in-ear microphones, and they have a pretty insane setup in an anechoic room with this massive sphere. And what that allows us to do is measure how sound coming from all different directions in a full 360-degree sphere actually behaves by the time it gets into our ear hole. We're able to profile and calibrate our own heads, which means that then, like what we did earlier with the measurement rigs, taking the HRTF away from the measurement to then get a much more clear picture of what is actually being heard, we can now do the same thing for ourselves.
So that process was, we put microphones in the ear canal entrance point. So we're not putting microphones where our eardrums are, but because we are using the HRTF measured at the same point that we're measuring the headphones, because we have these microphones at home, we measure at home, and then we can just subtract that HRTF away. It is actually a very perceptually relevant result. So in the process of getting our HRTFs measured at the ear canal entrance point with open canal microphones, I don't remember if I mentioned that.
This is where the trouble started.
This is where the trouble starts. So on the top, you can see our 4 open canal diffuse field HRTFs. And this is for me, Cameron, Andrew, and our other reviewer, Caleb. You can see broadly, in terms of shape, they agree fairly well. There's maybe some deviation here and there, but from the bass all the way into the mid-range, pretty good agreement. And the features line up, like there's that dip in the 3K region, and there's that other dip around 7 to 8K. But the problem is that when we measure headphones on our head, they don't track this behavior. Kind of similar to the HRTFs that we looked at for rigs, the headphone responses don't perfectly track, because what's happening on your head is not the same interaction that's happening with a speaker at a distance, which any HRTF is kind of a measurement of.
Yeah, and as you can see from the bottom graph there, we're seeing a lot more deviation in terms of what the behavior of the headphone, and this is the same unit. This isn't even a different unit. We did the same one.
Same unit, same session. We were all right next to each
office.
other. Yeah.
We're seeing a lot more difference there with the same exact headphone on our heads than there are differences in our HRTFs, which again goes to show that it's not just our ears being different. It's not just that our HRTFs are different. The headphone is genuinely behaving different on our heads. We are genuinely hearing different things. It's not just that I prefer more treble or less treble or whatever. We're actually hearing different things, even though it is the exact same headphone. Yeah. And in fact, this one shows it a little more clearly as well, just how drastic that can be.
Yeah, so this is a headphone-specific behavior as well, and this is kind of what I wanted to show with this slide. So on the top, we have the HD800S, and on the bottom, we have the HD600, all the same unit. So we literally just took the unit off my head, on his head, and then to the other reviewers. And you can see, again, there's broad agreement, but there are differences, and the difference magnitude does change.
So just to be clear, these ones, the difference here is that was just the headphone just measured on our heads just straight away.
Yes, so that last one, the HD600, that's a raw measurement. What you're seeing on the next slide is diffuse field compensated measurements.
So we've taken our ears and our normal effect out of the equation. This is just showing the differences in what we're actually experiencing.
Yes, this is the difference in headphone behavior on our heads. So if you look at the HD600 in particular, I think it's kind of interesting because it's kind of just all over the place. Like there's a general trend, but a lot of people who may be familiar with our content may know that I'm a little bit treble sensitive. I am often memed as being a treble hater. But if you look at the response of the HD600 here, I am getting the most treble in certain spots, like 3 to 4 or 5 kilohertz and 10, 11 kilohertz. Whereas Cameron, who typically has less complaints about treble than I do, I think, is getting a much smoother response, and I am envious.
Yeah, but then even then, it goes to show, like on the HD600, I believe the blue one is Andrew, and he's getting the most even response throughout the treble, which kind of explains why he's the biggest fan of that headphone compared to the rest of us. Whereas it's not just that we prefer different things. I'm just not getting as good a result on my head. It is deviating from what my brain expects to hear at my eardrum as neutral far more than it is on Andrew.
Yeah, but also just really quick, want to talk about the HD800S. In the bass, you'll notice this big difference right here. I would say don't worry too much about that. Caleb wears glasses and he has kind of a small head. But on the HD600, these differences you're seeing, with Andrew specifically, I think it's interesting because you get this more downsloped response all the way until 5 kilohertz, and it's just because he has a massive head. But with the HD800 also, I did want to mention that the features themselves are seemingly a little bit more similar across the lot of us. We're not exactly sure why this is. We have some theories. We can maybe talk about that in the question portion. But yeah, just wanted to point that out, that it is a headphone-specific thing, and you tend to see certain headphones be a little bit more well-behaved in this regard than others.
So what does this actually mean for us then? It means that there is enough difference in headphone behavior that you shouldn't treat what you hear as an objective truth that other people are going to experience. And it also means that for the same, if you see an impression from someone else, you shouldn't necessarily expect that you are going to get exactly the same thing. Not just because you have different preferences, but because you are going to actually be hearing different things with the same headphone. Even if it is the same unit, it is going to actually sound different to you than it will to the person sitting next to you.
And this goes for measurements as well. I think a lot of us are going to be used to seeing measurement visualizations on site like Crinical's graph tool or SquigLink, and most of those places will just display a single line on a single target. And I don't want to say that is useless. If you know the idiosyncrasies of those fixtures and how they relate to your own experience, which you can get pretty good at with experience, it can be okay. But most of the people just see a line on a screen and there's an implied authority of data that makes them take that perhaps more seriously than they should. So I would encourage you all to have a little bit of doubt when you see a single line measurement in basically any circumstance, because it's really not a good distillation of headphone behavior, certainly not for an individual if it's measured on a test fixture. But even if it's measured on one of our heads, we're humans, but our heads still aren't your heads.
And actually, it's also worth noting, we've got a video on it, but this also goes to show why, I don't know if any of you have tried auto EQ before, just getting an automatically generated EQ profile for a headphone and thought, this isn't quite working for me. This kind of shows why, because if I, for example, was using an EQ profile generated from a measurement rig that behaved like this blue line, but then I behave like this green line, it's going to be 10 dB too bright for me here. And it's not even going to match even closely among the rest of it. So tools like auto EQ or EQing based on a measurement you see online, you can pretty accurately do that below 1 kilohertz. But above that, you really do need to be making much broader adjustments and then listening and trying to identify where particular peaks and dips are on your head, not what the measurement from either a GRASS or a 5128 are showing, because statistically it would be an absolute miracle if they are the same on your head. So there's a few questions which are going to come up. Why is it that headphones are actually behaving so differently, even though they should just be interacting with our ears and our ears should be doing all the same things that they're normally doing for real-world sound? It's not like we're covering that bit of the ear. Is this going to happen with all headphones, or are there certain types of headphones which are not going to vary or are going to vary less?
Or are going to vary in the exact same way an HRTF would vary, because that would essentially mean you could just compensate away the HRTF and get what you're getting.
Yeah.
And then, there's how does knowing this actually help you? How can you go forth from this presentation and actually improve either your experience or your ability to triangulate what might be good for you?
Yeah. So on that first point, I think the first one was something which you'll probably have heard of quite a bit, which is just positioning. And if you go and try any headphone and you move it about on your head, you'll be able to hear that it sounds different. And this can be down to a few different reasons. Sometimes it's as simple as certain positions you're actually getting a proper seal or a better seal, and other ones you're not. But then because headphones, unlike speakers, where a speaker is going to be doing the exact same thing whether you're in the room or not, it doesn't really care that you're there. A headphone is operating in such close proximity that the acoustic impedance, the resistance to change in sound pressure, is going to be different at different frequencies and change depending on how your ear is sitting in, where it's positioned on your ear, and that is going to actually change the behavior of the headphone itself. So positional variation can be, as you can see on this graph, quite a massive factor. Just moving it around is going to change the response quite a lot, which is also why when we measure headphones, we don't just plonk it on a rig, do a sweep, call it a day. We do about 20 different positions and then average them to make sure that we're getting something which is representative of what people are going to be hearing.
Yeah, and for this example, I did choose a particularly positionally variant design. This is the Grill OAE2. I think it's at the show downstairs if you guys want to hear it. You can kind of get an example of this just by putting it on your head and shifting it forward and backward. The headphone's driver is very frontally oriented, so it does in effect just move the driver closer and farther to your ear. As you move it closer to your ear, moving the headphone back, you'll get more of that upper mid-range energy. As you move it further away, you'll get less. Now, you did mention in there acoustic impedance, which is, I think, in a lot of our content, a concept we haven't really explained all of that well. And it does kind of vex people, and it certainly did vex me for a while. The way I'm going to describe this is that certain frequencies, like stiff air that can be moved more efficiently by a driver. Think about a spring, a really rigid spring. If you try to push on one end of it, the other end will move very close to with an energy very close to the energy you pushed it with. But a very loose spring, a very compliant spring, won't move as much if you push it. So if you think about the air as a spring, and you think about the headphone driver as the pushing, with bass, you want really stiff air because that needs less energy to actually move efficiently. So if you have a sealed volume, this is a closed back headphone, if you have a well-sealed volume, you might get something more like the green result here, where you're getting all the bass you want, and that's great. If you're not getting a sealed volume, what happens is the air loses its stiffness because there's an escape path, so the air is now loose and flowy. So you're going to get something more like the red one, because the bass needs air stiffness to actually propagate properly, whereas mid-range and treble, not so much.
Yeah. And then the last thing is just what we've been talking about so far, which is that the fine-grained features of your ear not only are naturally going to change things in different ways, but also, again, because they are sitting in such close proximity and actually building on the acoustic impedance aspect, there are going to be different resonances formed between different parts of your ears and different parts of the headphone, as well as just the behavior of the headphone due to the acoustic impedance changing, which is going to cause some pretty different results. So then the next question is, do these affect all headphones? Is there a kind of headphone design that would mitigate all of these and just behave exactly the same on everyone, or is this just a universal problem? Well, unfortunately, yes.
It's a universal problem.
Yes, it is.
Yep, no escaping it, sorry.
And that's about that. There's not really much more to say. Every headphone is going to vary to some degree. Some are going to be much worse. Things like closed back headphones, for example, are going to vary drastically more across different people, whereas the theory at the moment is that generally lower acoustic impedance, so much more open headphones, are going to behave more consistently. But how does knowing this actually help you?
Yeah, so as we've said already, a single measurement on a single head that isn't your own isn't sufficient to predict your experience. A single person's experience will never correlate to your own, of course. But with all of this, it's really just indications of an acoustic event, whether it's measurements or an impression. And we can only experience our own acoustic event. And we can communicate that to others as best as we can, but even so, language is limited. Yeah. And I really just think this means we need to make room for disagreement so there's less confusion and more acceptance.
It's almost easy enough to go as far as to say it's not even to accommodate disagreement, but to just expect different experiences. Yeah. If you see a measurement and it doesn't align with what you expect, it doesn't necessarily mean that either your ears are wrong or the measurement was done wrong or something. It's just worth knowing that there are limitations and degrees of variability to this. Same as if you are talking to someone and you have a different experience with a headphone, or you've had pretty consistent differences between them, it doesn't mean that they're deaf or that they're just upset that they can't afford whatever you've got or whatever. You are definitely hearing different things, and that is going to cause differences which not are just potential, but to be expected. And the audio space would be a better place generally, I think, if people were a little bit less on, nope, this is my opinion, this is what I heard. If you disagree with it, clearly you're wrong and I'm not going to listen to you anymore. And in fact, I'm going to go and post some mean stuff about you elsewhere as well. So yeah, less confusion and more acceptance. Because the other thing is that because of what we talked about in the previous slide, where different headphones are going to vary to different degrees, something which doesn't really get talked about enough in reviews or feedback online is the fact that some headphones are going to be more consistent, which is arguably quite a good thing. And other headphones are going to vary much more, which is arguably quite a bad thing. And that gets masked by people bickering about whether they liked it or what they heard, when actually part of the review process, in my opinion, should be, are you likely to get the expected result? Or are you just, it's a crapshoot, excuse my language, as to whether you're going to get anything good?
Yeah, actually, there's this, I wish we had thought of what you're talking about right now when we were making this, because there's this great post from Sean Olive on Blue Sky. He just did some research with Dan Clark not too long ago, trying to get a version of the Harman target for the 5128. But something that didn't make it into the paper was that they actually did open canal ear entrance point measurements of one of Dan's headphones, and they showed that the variation was very wide across listeners, basically across the entire frequency response, not just in the treble like we see with the headphone behavior of the HD600 and HD800S. And something that Sean was saying was, what is really the point of a target response if your headphone can't reliably replicate that target response? And I think it's really interesting that basically the reason we talk about target responses, the target guy, is saying things like this, because it indicates that, yeah, it's a very serious issue that it's probably under-discussed.
I mean, think about if you were buying a camera and you've got two options. One of them, it's got pretty good colors, it's nice and accurate and sharp and stuff, and every single camera that you get takes these photos exactly the same. You know what you're going to get. And then there's another camera where some people get, it's just the most beautiful images you'll ever see. The colors are rich, the dynamic range is immense, but then 30% of them, every picture comes out tinted blue. And then for another batch, 30% of people that buy this, it comes out tinted green. Which camera are you going to get? The one that might give you a better result, but you're quite likely to get something terrible, or the one that's definitely going to give you a decent result?
Well, yeah, what's interesting is I don't think camera enthusiasts would ever accept the latter.
No, they wouldn't. And I think the only reason that people accept it in this hobby at the moment is because it's so under-discussed. Yeah. And there's not enough data, because most of the time when you see a measurement, it is just on one head. And that's something which we're trying to solve, where in our future reviews we'll have measurements on multiple measurement rigs and on our own heads as well, so we can not only show you how it would measure as someone else would do it, but also here's my description of what I'm hearing. By the way, here's a graph that actually shows exactly what I'm hearing. The next thing that we don't necessarily understand, though, is how some of the differences caused by the HRTF actually then impact the research that we've got on preference. Because we do know that preference is still a thing. Yeah. Even outside of what you are actually hearing, some people do just genuinely prefer a ton more bass.
Yeah, and it must be said, even with all of the variation we see in HRTFs, even with all the variation we saw in the HPTFs, the frequency response as measured on our heads, people still broadly preferred the Harman target when it was tested, right? There are still ways that people can converge on features that are broadly good. It's just we're not exactly sure how much things like HRTF or HPTF on a person's actual head actually influenced the results that came about in these studies. And it's an interesting thing to think about, just because HRTFs do kind of form our baseline expectation of timbre. And HRTF is the sound that our ears commit to all incoming sound from the world for our entire lives. And we've learned to judge everything against this baseline. So when we put a headphone on our head, we are judging it against that baseline, but we just don't know how that affects all of the variation we see in things like Harman's 2013 paper.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see some preference research where every single participant had their own HRTF compensated for, and we could see just what the actual differences in preferences without any of the ear effects built in were. But unfortunately, it's quite difficult to do. So
it's the kind of thing we'd love to do ourselves, but it's quite expensive to do with a large group of people.
It's difficult enough getting 4 of us to do it. So, but what about the stuff that people talk about outside of frequency response? What about the technicalities, the detail, the soundstage, and all that kind of stuff? Well, the thing is, Headphones are what's called a minimum phase device, which means that the phase response, the time domain behavior, is actually completely predictable from the frequency response, and vice versa. If you measure a headphone, in fact, you can actually test this at home. If you don't even need an accurate measurement rig. If you
just use a mic with a cardboard
Get
box.
a bit of cardboard,
Yeah.
shove a mic through it,
Yeah.
measure a headphone on it, and you can see the frequency response in Room EQ Wizard, and you can also see what the phase response, the time domain behavior was. And then you can also tell Roo, generate a minimum phase response for this, which means generate the phase response that we'd expect if this was a perfectly minimum phase system. And you can then
Generate the frequency response.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. And you can then look at the excess group delay or excess phase response, which shows what is the difference between the phase that we got when we measured it and the phase that a minimum phase system with this frequency response would have. And for just about every single headphone we've tested, it is no difference. It's only really going to be different if there's things like a crossover in it, for example, multiple drivers and things like that. But that means that we can predict the time domain behavior from the frequency response. It's not actually a separate thing, which is different to speakers. With speakers, there's a lot of stuff going on there.
There's basically always crossovers. There's, time interactions actually happening in the space.
And so, I see you.
Yeah, I was just going to say about that. I think this can be kind of unintuitive to people to see frequency response as a metric that is descriptive of time. But I think if you think about it in terms of treble always being faster, it's shorter wavelengths, they travel and don't need as much time to get to their destination, whereas low frequencies are a lot bigger, longer, they need a lot more room to complete a full cycle. If you think about a snare drum or a kick drum, something that's very immediate, the treble of that sound is going to be arriving to your ear first, then the mid-range, then the bass. And if you think about a frequency response, say the HD 800, the treble is going to be plenty prominent. So the very first sub-millisecond stuff you're going to get pretty clearly. But as you get into the treble, instead of thinking of these as dips in the frequency response alone, you can actually kind of think about them as dips in the time response. You can't think about it as you're getting a peak in the upper treble, you're getting plenty of energy there, but then there's a dip right after that initial transient impulse. And then it comes back up when the treble comes back up, and then it goes back down when the mid-range is recessed, and vice versa. Just something to think about. Because I think a lot of the talk about dynamics or other speed or Pratt.
Yeah, people will say, it's a faster driver, which actually means it's got more treble extension.
It's got more treble relative to bass, or it's got more mid-range relative to bass.
Yeah, and there are drivers which are faster in that they would have a higher maximum frequency, but the other thing there is if only up to 20 kilohertz is coming out of your DAC, then having a frequency response that does extend up to 100 kilohertz is not super important. But what this also means is that things like timbre, soundstage, and detail are actually captured in the frequency response. The problem is that we don't necessarily know how to interpret them yet, and this is where a lot of the debate stems from. People will say frequency response doesn't tell you how detailed a headphone is or whether it's going to sound big and soundstagey. But it does, we just don't quite know how to get it out of the line yet.
And importantly, I think a lot of the disagreement about where it comes from the fact that we're not experiencing the same things. If my buddy Daniel here says something is technical, I may just disagree. And it's not because one of us is inherently wrong, it's just because we're getting different behaviors on our heads.
There are certain things which we are better at interpreting from frequency response. In fact, actually, soundstage is kind of one of them. So we know that this feature, for example, the dip kind of around 2 kilohertz-ish area is something which on a lot of headphones that people report as sounding big and soundstagey, Sennheiser HD100S, Hypermans, or a lot of Hypermans to be honest, that is a common occurrence. And in fact, if you just EQ that in yourself, it makes a headphone sound bigger. Yeah, but then things like detail are tricky for two reasons. One is, firstly, people don't even agree on what the term actually means. Like when you ask them to describe it, they'll give you different explanations. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. They'll give you different explanations. But then also because, especially in the high frequencies, which we do know is generally what people are talking about when they are talking about detail, even if they're not actually agreeing on what it means, people are experiencing such different things that trying to extract which headphone is more detailed than the other just from the frequency response on a particular head is basically impossible. And I don't really know what the solution to that is, but...
Yeah, I don't know either.
Well-
There are some academic efforts to, I know some people won't be a fan of this, but standardize the audiophile lexicon a bit and attach what people are saying as qualities like detail or timbre or
I still don't know what
soundstage.
PRAP means.
Yeah, there is an academic effort to standardize those terms and kind of come up with a unified glossary for this stuff. I'm sure as soon as it's released, people will disagree vehemently and there will be uproar across the internet. But I do think that's one of the only ways I think we could ever find what soundstage actually correlates to, what dynamics actually correlates to. Because
Yes,
otherwise,
but you try getting HeadPhi to agree on anything, let alone the entire dictionary of subjective terms that we use to describe sound.
never have, never will.
So for now, bit of a tough task. Do you want to take the EQ one?
Yeah, sure. So obviously we've done a lot of talking about how measurements on different heads vary. This is a slide of our new measurement database, which is a perk for our Sonic Plus members on headphones.com. It is currently in beta. But something we're really proud of is that you can visualize it not as just a single line, but you can take measurements from different test fixtures here. You can see this is the HD620S from Sennheiser measured on 4 different fixtures. These are Resolve's measurements on the 5128, the Gross KB 5000 equipped ear. This is DMS's measurements on the 4128 and my measurements on a KB006 equipped Gross system. And you can see, holy crap, there's a lot of variation. Typically closebacks are the worst for this. But just the variation in the treble is something I kind of want to draw attention to because they're basically the size of the entire boundary, the preference boundary that's behind it. So when you're doing EQ, say based on a single measurement line like you typically would be, it can be very tempting to make the headphone measurement line want to match the target line. And I know this may look a little bit less authoritative, a little bit more mushy, but we actually think this is a better way to view this data because we think one of the bigger, maybe even the biggest issues to do with the discussion and discourse around measurements is overconfidence. People have learned enough to feel like they know completely, and so they feel confident making all sorts of assumptions about how these things actually behave. But as we've shown in this presentation, it's really not a safe bet to make.
It's quite common to see people, looking at a measurement of a headphone and going, oh, it's 1 dB above the Harman target here. Clearly, it's terrible.
Incredibly common.
Yes.
Infuriatingly common.
In fact, one of the first things we did after getting our HRTFs and stuff is we went back to my office and we measured a bunch of headphones. In fact, we EQ'd one so that it was absolutely perfect Harman on the grass rig, and then we tested it on our heads, and it was nowhere even close. And in fact, it also just straight up sounded worse than the headphone out of the box.
Yeah.
Because we're not getting the result that you'd expect. So any kind of single line target that you use for measurements is inherently flawed for the simple reason that you're just not going to get anything close to the expected response on your own head. It's just not possible, which is why for a long time we have been using these preference bounds. There is a range of what people prefer, and there is a wide range of what people are actually going to experience with any given headphone, and you have to account for that range. If you don't, you are, as you said, I think, being overconfident to say the least. And then the other thing, the last one, is that when you are wanting to EQ headphones yourself, which we would highly recommend you do, learning to EQ comprehensively is one of the best things you can do to enhance your experience. And it's something which you do get better at with practice. Learning using data like this and being able to know, right, this is where it's pretty confident. It seems like it's behaving the same on just about everyone. This one doesn't, but a lot of headphones, particularly open back ones, are generally going to be almost the same below 1 kilohertz as we saw earlier. So you can just go based on pretty much any measurement for that. But above that, learning to use tools like a tone generator. So it's just a sine suite which you drag along and listening and going, oh, suddenly it's way louder, so I know I've got a peak here. It doesn't matter what the measurement says, I'm getting a peak here. I can take that down, and now it sounds better.
Yeah,
Anything
very
above,
simple changes like that can make very large differences in how much you prefer a headphone's response.
Yeah.
There are many cases where I just have one peak with a headphone that once I remove it, it becomes exceptional.
Yeah, and I think that's something which a lot of people, when they're EQing headphones, are thinking about or being told to correct the response entirely, change the headphone. If you get a chance to, just go home, search tone generator on Google and just see where the 2 or 3 biggest peaks on whatever headphone you're listening to is. And just take those down. Don't change anything else. Literally just kill the peaks and see how much better it sounds.
Yeah. Now, you might find that the technicalities suffer a little bit. But
Sometimes peaks help with the technicalities, even if they then hurt other areas.
it's not really the point of this presentation. But not all errors are going to be heard as errors. There are some things like peaks in the treble that commit a nice presentation or a nice aspect about the sound, highlight something nice about it. But I would say if you do identify a peak and cut it and you hear the technicalities go away, feel free to just put it back. You're not losing anything by trying it. But I would encourage you to listen to a wide variety of music and see which actually works better with the wide variety of music, because I think you might be surprised which one works better.
Yeah. But I think the summary of all of this, and where we'll leave it and start asking questions, is leave room for disagreement. Just because you and someone else have a different opinion on a headphone, it doesn't mean that one of you is wrong, deaf, or just is upset they can't afford something. You are almost certainly hearing very different things. And quite often, it's really interesting to talk to people and see what the differences between certain things that you hear are. In fact, it's you and me, sometimes we'll just message and go, are you getting this? And you go, no, I'm hearing this. And it's weird and almost baffling how different certain experiences can be. And it can also be helpful in terms of finding people that will generally trend similarly to hearing similar things to you. I've got a couple of friends who actually seemingly have very similar ears to mine, and there's not been many headphones which have behaved drastically differently. But then there's other people where I even if I'm great friends with them, I trust them implicitly in terms of what they're saying. I just know that I'm not going to be hearing the same thing, and so it's pointless even taking into account their opinion or giving them mine, because they're just not relevant to each other at all.
Yeah, no, I have the same experience.
Yeah, expecting agreement was the mistake. Has anyone got any questions?